Hello everybody, I'm Nubicus Maximus, the Disgruntled Jedi, and today we've got an article from good old Forbes and Scott Mendelson, who, even though this is my first time covering him, I have read many an article from Scott Mendelson, enough to know that he has a very unique opinion on things. This article is titled, "Star Wars, Not Sexism, is to blame for the new Ghostbusters sequel." So already, this should be really entertaining. So, let's get into his article. "I shudder to think of the notion that we're going to have to spend the next year essentially rehashing the great culture Ghostbusters war. Of course, if we could have a different outcome in 2020 than we did in 2016, specifically by electing whomever the Democrats run for president this time, that would be swell, but I digress." Yeah, seriously, dude. What does the presidential election have to do with Ghostbusters? The election was at the end of the year. The movie was created at the beginning of the year. What does the presidential election have anything to do with Ghostbusters, or how Ghostbusters did, or getting a new Ghostbusters, which I would like to see? "I totally understand why Leslie Jones is upset, as she is about Sony's new plans for Jason Reitman-directed Ghostbusters movie." That's funny, because I really have no idea why she's upset. She was a part of a reboot. They are making a sequel to the original, and she's making it sound like her movie was the first. So, it wasn't. Doesn't mean there couldn't be a sequel to her Ghostbusters movie, but the two are clearly separate, as described in her movie. However, the movie turns out it's hard not to view the film as a glorified rebuttal of the 2016 reboot and a relative victory for the very worst Ghostbusters fans that turned the Paul Feig-directed all-lady reboot into a giant online talking point. That's especially true as, being a black woman daring to exist online, Jones arguably got the worst of it. Now, I'll be honest, I did not see the 2016 Ghostbusters reboot. I saw the previews, and it did not look interesting in the slightest. I didn't laugh during any of the previews. It had nothing to do with the fact that the cast was women, but more to do with the fact that they just didn't deliver their lines in a proper fashion. So I had no interest to go see it, and none of my friends had an interest to go see it. So the only way I was going to go see it was if I went alone, and I didn't really want to go alone. So I didn't see it. I do remember the Twitter debate with Jones, but I seem to also recall her kind of stirring the pot in the process too. Yeah, she got the raw end of the jackasses on Twitter, but especially this time, she's definitely stirring the pot on her own. But if this movie is able to have its cake please the fans, and eat it too, offer something that isn't four middle-aged dudes making jokes and busting ghosts, then it may actually be a net positive for Kristen Wiig, Melissa McCarthy, Leslie Jones, Kate McKinnon's sci-fi comedy. Yeah, we're probably going to see a new group of Ghostbusters, more than just the originals, but I think the originals are going to play a much bigger role, probably an administrative role, which will be excellent to see how they torture the younger crowd. "I wrote last month about how Aquaman's blowout success allowed Zack Snyder's divisive Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice to no longer bear the burden of justifying an entire cinematic universe, and could now be judged, warts and all, as a standalone superhero opera that it otherwise would have been." I've never judged Batman vs. Superman as anything other than a standalone film, and it wasn't that good, in my opinion. I mean, I know some people really liked it. My brother loved it. I did not. It had nothing to do with the greater universe, and everything to do with it didn't make a hell of a lot of sense. To the extent that both movies came to define the cinematic online culture war in 2016, it is ironic that both films faltered, relatively speaking, because the studios released an inferior cut in theaters and kept the vastly superior version for the Blu-ray. I will admit the extended cut of Dawn of Justice definitely was better than the theatrical version, but not by a lot. It mostly just added a bunch of stuff that they probably could have thrown in there, but decided not to. I don't recall Batman v Superman having a culture war. It was more fans just going, "This is crap," versus other fans going, "This is great." You're going to have those kind of divisions. I remember Ghostbusters being very polarized, and it being on the part of Ghostbusters. What does this have to do with Star Wars? Like Batman v Superman, which earned 873 million worldwide, Ghostbusters was tagged as a franchise imperiling flop, despite selling quite a few tickets. Where? Ghostbusters was the biggest grossing live-action comedy of 2016, give or take the more superhero-y Deadpool, earning $126 million domestic and $229 million worldwide. That was more than offhand. Bad Moms, Central Intelligence, and Neighbors 2. The problem is that partially due to prior development costs, IP expenses, and whatever did or didn't happen on set, the film cost an absurd $144 million to produce. It looks great. I will admit, what I saw in the trailers, special effects-wise, was beautiful. Acting-wise, not so much. But Sony was banking on an overseas interest in the Ghostbusters brand that wasn't there. Had its $126 million domestic gross led to a standard 35-65 domestic overseas split, then it would have earned $360 million, and we'd probably have gotten a sequel, but it lost $70 million for Sony and Friends, making a sequel absolutely out of the question. Woulda, shoulda, coulda, to be completely honest. The movie could have done this, could have done that, but it didn't, and therefore we don't get a sequel. And that's probably a good thing, because I don't really think the sequel would have done any better. After Star Wars The Force Awakens, Creed, and Jurassic World, going the legacy sequel route with Ghostbusters was the obvious play. Hey, Star Wars is here. Only 4 paragraphs into the article that has Star Wars as the first word in its title. Awesome. It's not a matter of rebuking the last Ghostbusters movie, but rather because that film was a by-itself reboot, which Sony relatively success with Casino Royale and Amazing Spider-Man aside, may have been its biggest mistake. It cannot exist in the same universe as Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2. Yeah, that was kind of a mistake. That was really kind of a mistake, because now if they're going to do a sequel of the originals, you can't be involved. By simple logic of the fact that you exist in a different universe. Sure, they could retcon the last film's continuity, but making a new Ghostbusters 3 isn't about the last Ghostbusters flopping or the cultural sexism at play. It's about The Force Awakens showing Hollywood that the legacy sequel was a much smarter play than the straight-up reboot. Duh. Absent the toxic fan base as opposed to the folks who just didn't like the movie, a failed reboot of Ghostbusters is little different than Sony's failed reboot remake of RoboCop and Total Recall. Yeah, you guys really need to stop trying to remake classic movies because they never come out as good. Probably should stop making bad sequels of movies too, but whatever you want to say. And the toxic fan base versus the fan base who just didn't like the movie is really, really small as far as I can tell. Every person I've ever talked to never said, I refuse to watch the movie because it is women. Instead, they said, the movie sucked. But again, that Sony is making a new Ghostbusters sequel, one that will apparently feature 4 young kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, who get into an adventure that may or may not involve the original cast members. I assume Dan Aykroyd and Ernie Hudson are showing up for sure. Isn't about erasing the last movie from existence. Fun fact. A reboot can't do that any more than a bad movie adaptation can erase a good book, or a fictionalized movie can retroactively change the real history or limit moviegoers' access to learning about the true story behind the true story. Gonna disagree with you here, to be completely honest. If a movie comes out and it's a bad reboot, it can taint the way that people see the movie going forward. It can taint the way that new members of the fan base see the movie. If people assume that the original 2 Ghostbusters were like the 2016 movie, and they like it, they're going to go see the original 2 if they haven't seen them before. If they didn't like it, they're going to avoid the original 2 and not see the sequel. If a book comes out with a really bad adaptation, Aragon comes to mind, I would never read that book because the movie was just terrible. Likewise, a bad ending, looking at you guys, Star Wars, Force Awakens and Last Jedi, really turned off a lot of the fans. Runs the risk of destroying parts of the series and the way that the characters would have evolved into their future, and makes the previous movies a little less enjoyable, because you think about Luke Skywalker and think about him moving forward in life and then going, wow, he was such a good kid with so much potential and he just done fucked up. That can most definitely harm a film. Even after Spider-Man Homecoming, there are folks who still watch and enjoy The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I will admit, I enjoyed The Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 a lot more than I enjoyed Spider-Man Homecoming, and a lot more than I enjoyed the Tobey Maguire Spider-Mans. I think it had to do more with the main actor, whose name is totally escaping me as I'm doing this, but I definitely enjoyed him as Spider-Man more than the other 2. Even though Edward Norton was replaced by Mark Ruffalo, fans and moviegoers still watch and enjoy The Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk is not the best example to do with this, because that is considered like one of the worst of the MCU and barely a part of the MCU. Now, don't get me wrong, I like it, but it doesn't fit. And Mark Ruffalo completely changing the character of Edward Norton almost makes that movie feel standalone as opposed to being a part of the MCU. Despite the fact that Tony Stark is in the movie, it still feels standalone. So, not your best example. Oh my god, he's still going on. Chris Nolan's Batman Begins didn't erase Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher's respective Batman movies. If anything, the redemption of the character through Chris Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy has allowed folks to better enjoy Schumacher's campier installments, especially Batman Forever, on their own merits. That is true. Batman has always been one of those things where, based on the version, you just enjoy the version that you like. Ghostbusters may or may not do that. People still watch Goldfinger even after Casino Royale retconned the previous 44 years of James Bond movies. Fans can still access... Holy crap, dude. How much of this are you going to go on with? He gives like 9 more examples, and I get where he's going here. A bad remake doesn't prevent you from enjoying the original, but it can taint the fan base in the eyes of new fans. That's the problem that he's missing here. Ghostbusters 3, spoiler! Oscar is evil and he kills Peter Venkman isn't about erasing the last reboot or retroactively validating the most toxic of toxic ghost bros. I've never once heard anyone refer to themselves as ghost bros. I would have liked to have seen a sequel to the reboot, but movies that lose $70 million while not being very leggy don't tend to get sequels. Ya done figured that one out, huh? Absent its responsibility of maintaining the IP or living up to the hype or justifying the online hate, Paul Feig and Kate... I'm not even going to try and say her name. Ghostbusters can exist as its own movie and its own thing, both for folks who didn't like it and folks who loved the hell out of it. I've seen no one who loved the hell out of it. Like Batman vs. Superman, the 2016 Ghostbusters can now be enjoyed or disliked via its standalone merit as a movie, rather than being judged on how it helped or hurt the brand, or helped or hurt a would-be cinematic universe. I'm pretty sure it destroyed any chance at a cinematic universe, and I'm sure it hurt the brand. The thing is, the fan base was strong enough to begin with that you say, we're going to do Ghostbusters 3, and you have an instant fan base. You say you're going to do Ghostbusters 2016 Part 2, and you have an instant backlash. That's the difference. In that sense, the sequel isn't a sword being wielded against the controversial female ensemble sci-fi comedy, but a shield that will allow it to just be a funny sci-fi comedy that happens to be about new Ghostbusters. Based on what I've seen, I'm not sure anything could allow it to just be a funny sci-fi comedy, because it didn't look like it was funny at all. But he is right in one thing, that this sequel isn't about blaming the 2016 Ghostbusters. This sequel is about giving fans what they wanted in the first place, despite not getting it in the first movie.
Anyway, I'm sorry, but that just happens to be how I feel about it. What do you think?
Let me know in the comments below.